In this week's video, we look around some wonderful homes. These houses were once home to the people who kept one of Britain's greatest ironworks running. Within these walls, children were born, miners returned home covered in coal dust, families gathered around their first wireless and eventually their first television. Today, we're stepping inside these ordinary homes to discover what life here really felt like.
Hello, welcome to Through Lucy's Lens weekly videos where I go somewhere interesting and hopefully you'll find them interesting too. It is brutally cold here in South Wales, but I've brought you to a place I'm so excited that I've wanted to come to for so long. We're going to look at some cottages, we're going to look at some ironworks. I'm going to warm up. I've actually got gloves on. It's March, by the way. But I'm glad it's freezing cold today because that's just going to give me a really good idea of how brutal it must have been to live here when it's cold like this. So let's go.
Today we're visiting Blaenavon Ironworks in South Wales, a site that helped shape Britain's Industrial Revolution and is now recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. When the ironworks opened in 1789, it was an ambitious and expensive venue, costing around £40,000 to build. 3 blast furnaces stood here, employing hundreds of skilled workers and producing thousands of tonnes of pig iron every year. By the early 19th century, this had become one of the most productive ironworks in Wales, supplying iron at a time when Britain was expanding rapidly through industry, transport and war. The success of the ironworks transformed what had once been open hillside into a thriving industrial community. Families arrived from established iron-making districts in Staffordshire, Shropshire and the West Midlands, bringing with them specialist skills needed to help keep the furnaces running. But today I'm going to step away from explaining how iron was made. I want to move away from the furnaces and into the homes of the people who worked here. Because behind every shift was a family. Every iron worker eventually left the heat, noise and smoke of the furnaces and returned home. These houses allow us to follow these families through almost 2 centuries of change, from the optimism of the late 18th century to the final years of industrial housing in the 1960s. And our journey begins here at Engine Row. These houses were built around 1788, before the furnaces were even fully operational. They weren't built for the poorest workers. Instead, they were intended to attract skilled iron workers from established iron-making districts such as Shropshire or Staffordshire. Men whose knowledge was essential if this ambitious new enterprise was going to succeed. Imagine arriving here as one of those first families. Only a short time earlier, this had been open hillside. Now enormous furnaces dominated the landscape. Smoke drifted across the valley. Wagons carrying coal, limestone and iron rumbled across the newly formed tracks, while hundreds of workers from across Britain began building entirely new lives here. For many of these families, this cottage would actually have felt surprisingly comfortable. Compared with the single-roomed cottages occupied by many agricultural labourers, these homes offered solid stone walls, glazed windows, separate living and sleeping areas, and enough room to even take a lodger upstairs if extra income was needed. One detail I particularly liked is the framed print of Iron Bridge hanging on the wall. It's easy to imagine a family bringing a reminder of home with them as they settled into this unfamiliar landscape. Even 200 years later, it reminds us that these simply weren't workers. They were people, leaving behind everything they knew to begin again somewhere else. Inside the house, possessions were still few but carefully chosen. Painted country furniture, rush mats, hand-woven wool curtains and patchwork quilts helped transform a newly built company cottage into a family home. The kitchen here was very much the heart of everyday life. It wasn't simply where meals were prepared, but it's where the children played, clothes were mended, neighbours called in, and families gathered together after long shifts. Much of daily life revolved around the warmth of the open fire. Just 50 years later, the very same cottage layout tells a completely different story. By the 1840s, many of the original skilled workers had moved into larger and more desirable housing elsewhere. Engine Row increasingly became home to the lower paid labourers and their growing families. Industrial workers' homes often became severely overcrowded. Parents commonly raised large families partly because childhood mortality remained tragically high, and partly because older children could eventually contribute to the household income. Taking in lodgers was also common, providing another valuable source of money. Walking through the cottage today, it's difficult not to wonder how so many people managed to live within these small rooms. In 1840, the furniture is noticeably plainer. Simple handmade stools and a rough wooden table. Very little decoration. Even though the rooms themselves haven't changed, they somehow feel smaller than they did in the 1780 cottage. Thanks to the 1841 census, we can begin to put names to some of the people who lived here. One household belonged to Emmanuel Hartshorn, who worked tending the coke heaps. He lived here with his wife, 2 young children and a young female lodger. Nearby lived Timothy McCarthy. His household included his wife, a baby, 2 sons employed at the ironworks, and another related family member. 9 people shared that cottage, and that level of overcrowding, or even more, wasn't unusual. The kitchen remained the centre of family life, but food was increasingly about practicality rather than variety. Staple foods included bread made from wheat or oats, potatoes, vegetables, cheese, butter, porridge and simple stews. Tea had become increasingly popular, while small beer remained a common everyday drink. Without refrigeration, preserving food was essential. Meat might be salted or smoked, while fruit could be turned into jams or preserves wherever possible. Looking around with my modern eyes, what stands out isn't simply the lack of decoration, but the absence of what we might call comfort. After spending 12 hours or more performing exhausting physical labour, returning home offered shelter, but very little opportunity for true rest. At the end of Engine Row stands a reconstruction of a truck shop. At first glance, it looks rather like any other ordinary village shop we might see recreated in lots of living museums. Bread sits on shelves alongside cheese, candles, pottery, household utensils and other everyday essentials. Yet the system behind shops like this could leave working families trapped in a cycle of dependence. Many industrial companies owned and operated their own shops. Rather than being paid entirely in cash, workers were sometimes issued with company tokens or credit that could only be spent in this shop. Prices were often higher than those charged elsewhere. Imagine collecting your wages after weeks of hard work, only to discover much of the money had already been spoken for. Potentially also a modern demon. Bread, flour, tea, candles, Everything the family needed had already been purchased on credit, leaving very little to take home. For many households, debt became almost a permanent part of daily life. The same company owned the workplace. The same company owned the houses. The same company sold the food. Critics of the truck system once remarked that it supplied a man with his cradle and his coffin, suggesting that every stage of the life could be controlled by a single employer. The practice caused enormous resentment across Britain's industrial communities and was gradually restricted before eventually being outlawed later in the 19th century. From here we leave the 19th century behind and walk across to Stack Square. Although the houses you'll see next were built at almost exactly the same time as Engine Row, the story they tell is different. Instead of watching an industrial community being created, we'll watch it grow old. Crossing into Stack Square feels like stopping into another lifetime. Today they tell a different story. Rather than creating one specific to a family that lived here, each cottage represents a different moment in the 20th century, allowing us to watch ordinary domestic life evolve across 4 decades. Many of you may remember the BBC series Coal House. I certainly do, and it's one of the reasons I've wanted to visit here for so long. These are the very houses used for that remarkable social history experiment, where modern families attempted to live exactly as their predecessors would have done. As we move through each cottage, something interesting happens. The furniture becomes more modern, electricity arrives, yet the buildings themselves seem increasingly tired. Walking into the 1927 cottage, the first impression is that life appears to have become more comfortable. Wallpaper replaces bare stone walls. Proper bedsteads stand where earlier generations had slept more simply. Small decorative touches suggest that families were beginning to personalise their homes rather than simply occupying them. One of the things I always notice as time moves forward is wallpaper. It seems like such a small detail, but choosing a pattern might have been one of the few opportunities families had to make a cottage feel their own. One of the greatest luxuries that people potentially had in 1927 was the wireless, or the radio. Powered by large batteries rather than mains electricity, it connected families to news, music and entertainment from far beyond the valleys. For communities that could often feel isolated, the wireless became the centre of family life, bringing in the wider world into a small stone house beneath the shadow of the ironworks. Despite the wireless, daily life remained remarkably hard. There was still no indoor bathroom, no running water, no central heating. Every bucket of water had to be carried indoors from a stand tap outside before being heated over the range. Although impossible to recreate completely today, it's not difficult to imagine the atmosphere inside these houses. Coal smoke drifting through the door, damp work clothes drying beside the fire, soap made by hand, fresh bread baking wherever flour could be spared. These ordinary smells form the backdrop to everyday family life. A large zinc bath was carried into the living room and placed in front of the fire. Water would take well over an hour to heat, bucket by bucket, over the range. Usually the father, returning home covered in coal dust, would bathe first. By the time some of the younger children climbed into the same water, it had often turned almost black. Fresh hot water just wasn't something families could afford to waste. The women who took part in the BBC experiment later described the relentless physical effort required simply to keep the household running. Without electricity or modern appliances, every task demanded time. Before breakfast there was the fire to light, water to fetch, ashes to empty, floors to scrub, clothes to wash, meals to prepare. By the time everyone else had gone to bed, the next day's work was already waiting. Outside the house, life had become increasingly uncertain. The 1926 general strike had ended in defeat, and many miners returned to work facing lower wages, longer hours, and continuing unemployment. Every loaf of bread, every lump of coal, every penny had to be carefully managed. Just 17 years later, the houses have changed again. In 1944, electricity had finally arrived. Simple electric light replaced candles and oil lamps, while a mains-powered wireless became one of the household's most treasured possessions. Families, neighbours would gather around it for BBC broadcasts, wartime announcements and news from across Europe. This wireless was your connection, your only connection to the wider world. Every news bulletin brought hope for some families and anxiety for others. Yet despite these modern improvements, many of the hardest parts of everyday life remained exactly the same. There was still no indoor bathroom, no flushing toilet, no running water. That familiar zinc bath still appeared beside the fire, and water still had to be heated before anyone could wash. The Second World War transformed family life inside these houses. Many of the houses became overcrowded as evacuee children arrived from Britain's bombed cities, while other households welcomed Bevin boys, young men sent by the government to work in the coal mines instead of serving on the front line. Privacy almost disappeared. Every corner of the house had to work harder for space than ever before. Food was another daily challenge. Ration books carefully controlled how much butter, sugar, meat and eggs each family could buy. Gardens and small plots behind the cottages suddenly became essential for producing potatoes, cabbage and other vegetables under the Dig for Victory campaign. The women again carried an extraordinary burden. Along cooking, cleaning and raising children, many also worked long hours supporting Britain's war effort before returning home to continue the endless cycle of domestic work. As darkness fell each evening, another routine began. Heavy blackout curtains covered every window. Families gathered around the wireless in near darkness, hoping that another night would pass peacefully. By the late 1950s, Britain was beginning to look forward. This cottage immediately feels brighter than the wartime interior. For many families, this would have been the first opportunity to watch national events unfold from their own living room. The kitchen had changed too. Heavy iron ranges had given way to electric or gas cookers. Electric kettles, irons, vacuum cleaners and twin-tub washing machines gradually entered the working-class home, reducing hours of physical labour. For the first time, many families could afford to buy these appliances through hire purchase. Progress had arrived, but not evenly. Perhaps the greatest contradiction inside this house in 1957 is that a family could spend the evening watching television before putting on their big coats and walking outside to the toilet. Despite owning electrical appliances, many families still washed in a zinc bath. The technology inside the house had changed much faster than the building itself. Former residents consistently describe a close-knit community where neighbours helped one another, doors were left unlocked and children played safely around the square. Something else is worth mentioning as we go into these last two houses. Modern visitors or even people in the comments often ask, why is the wallpaper peeling? Why aren't they looking after it better? Surely people would have repaired them. But the answer lies in understanding the difference between being house proud and being wealthy. Former residents repeatedly describe scrubbing, polishing, redecorating and caring deeply for their homes. But by the 1950s, these houses had already stood here for almost 180 years. Coal smoke, damp, constant occupation, wallpaper aged, plaster cracked. Looking after your home didn't necessarily mean making it look new. They weren't neglected houses. They were ageing houses, and people were doing their best. One of the things I always find myself doing in houses like this is trying to build a timeline in my head. These houses had already stood here for almost 170 years by the time this room potentially looked like this. Think about that for a moment. Generations of children learnt to walk across these flagstone floors. Thousands of meals were cooked here. Layer and layer upon wallpaper came and went, while outside the world changed almost beyond recognition. When these houses were built, the French Revolution hadn't even begun yet. By the time people left for the last time, someone might have sat in this room and watched a man land on the moon on television. And yet these walls remained. To me, that is one of the real joys of social history. How exciting is it to stand in a place where the only distance between us and the people who once lived here is time? I'll never tire of thinking who has been here before me. What were they thinking as they stare from the window in their thoughts, just as we're doing today? The final house brings us to almost the end of people living here. Set in 1967, at first glance it feels remarkably familiar. Perhaps that's why this room speaks to me more than many of the others. It no longer really feels like stepping into history. It feels like stepping into my grandparents' house. Plastic kitchenware, electric cookers, carpets, television, a mains-powered radio. Many visitors will recognise details that remind them of their own childhood. Yet beneath these modern comforts, the reality remained extraordinary. Even by the late 1960s, there was no indoor bathroom facilities, water was still collected from a standpipe outside, and the communal toilets remained behind the square. And for most families, you guessed it, the zinc bath still appeared on wash day. Among the final residents living here were families such as the Parfits and Mr. Bowler, who continued living here right up until 1970. Contemporary photographs show homes that were neat, welcoming and clearly loved despite the lack of facilities that most of us would now consider essential. Eventually the cottages were declared unfit for habitation. They were damp, poorly ventilated and offered no appropriate sanitation. The remaining families of Stack Square were rehoused into new council properties around the area. For many, however, that move was bittersweet. They gained their bathroom, hot running water, central heating and modern kitchens, but they left behind something that couldn't easily be rebuilt, a community. Neighbours who'd lived side by side for generations. Children who'd grown up together around the remains of the old chimney stack. Homes filled with memories stretching back almost 2 centuries. By the early 1970s, the cottages finally fell silent. Instead of being demolished, they were preserved, allowing us to walk through almost 200 years of ordinary family life beneath one roof. Before we leave Stack Square, I have to show you the communal toilets that served generations of families and remained in use astonishingly late into the 20th century. Coming out here on a cold winter's night in heavy rain, leaving for work before the sunrise, it was simply life. It feels like a fitting place to end our journey today, because it was built using the iron from the very works that created this community. The church connects every generation we've encountered today. The skilled workers who arrived in the 18th century, the crowded Victorian families, the children who sat around the wireless in 1927, those who sat thinking and hoping their loved ones would come back from the war, and the final residents who eventually had to move away. Many would have been baptised here, married here, grieved here, and were eventually laid to rest in the churchyard, among the remarkable cast iron gravestones that survive today. The furnaces may have built Blaenavon, but the houses tell us how people lived because of them. Ordinary families cooked here, worked here, raised children here, argued here, celebrated here, and eventually said goodbye to the homes that had served generation after generation. And that's why places like this genuinely matter to me. History isn't only found, as we know, in great buildings or famous names. For me, it's waiting quietly behind an ordinary front door. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed stepping inside these remarkable homes with me, I'd love to have you join our growing community here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. I have over 100 videos on the channel already celebrating the lives of extraordinary, ordinary people. Hopefully to help you relax, unwind, enjoy, and maybe learn a little something. Every single one of you is allowing me to spend my spare time doing what I love, and I'm so grateful. Until next time, thank you for watching. Goodbye.